Good morning. My name is Pauline Adès-Mével, and I am the spokesperson and the editor-in-chief of Reporters Without Borders, RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières, in France. Thank you very much for welcoming me today and to let me open the Forum of Mediterranean Women Journalists. It's an honor. It's the third year I join you for this very important event for women journalists and the press freedom in Europe and throughout the world. This year the situation is particular, we can't join, but I would like, even though we cannot meet and take part of the forum in the normal conditions, to express to you the support of Reporters Without Borders to all journalists, and to expose also the latest findings of Reporters Without Borders in its latest index that we published in April 2020. So I would like to give you some elements that we wrote and published earlier this year. I would like also to make a special focus on Europe, of course. So we are in Italy and it's very important. And also, I would like also, even though we will be talking about the virus, to mention the online pressures on journalists. We know that female journalists are more than other the target of those who want to silence them. So it's pretty important. I would like first to present the analysis of Reporters Without Borders and the World Press Freedom Index. This edition was compiled for publication in April and shows that the coming decade will be decisive for the future of journalism, with the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting and amplifying the many crises that threaten the right to freely reported, independent, diverse and reliable information. We faced a very important sanitary crisis, but at Reporters Without Borders, we think that it's an additional one, and we are facing others, especially for the coming decade. This 2020 edition of the index, which evaluates the situation for journalists each year in 180 countries or territories, suggests that the next 10 years will be pivotal for press freedom because of converging crises affecting the future of journalism, a geopolitical crisis due to the aggressiveness of authoritarian regime. We will see this in Hungary, for example, a technological crisis due to a lack of democratic guarantees, a democratic crisis due to the polarization and the repressive policies, a crisis of trust due to the suspicion and even hatred of the media bashing we see everywhere, and an economic crisis impoverishing quality journalism everywhere. These 5 areas of crisis, the effect of which the index methodology allows us to evaluate, are now compounded with a global public health crisis. This COVID-19 crisis that started at the beginning of 2020 is lasting and will impact the journalism for a very long time. We are entering a decisive decade for journalism, linked to crises that affect its future. The coronavirus pandemic illustrates the negative factor threatening the right to reliable information, with the pandemic itself an exacerbating factor. So what will freedom of information, pluralism and reliability look like in 2030? The answer of that question is being determined today, and we all have to act in order to save free journalism and freedom of information. What we saw at Reporters Without Borders is that there is a clear correlation between the suppression of media freedom in response to the coronavirus pandemic and a country's ranking in the index. Let me give you some examples. Both China, ranked 177th, and Iran, ranked 173rd, censored their major coronavirus outbreaks extensively, from the start, actually. They were the first countries. In Iraq, which is 162nd, the authorities stripped some journalists from Reuters of its license for 3 months after they published a story questioning official coronavirus figures. So even in Europe also, Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, ranked 89th in our index, had a coronavirus law passed with penalties up to 5 years in prison for false information or a completely disproportionate and coercive measures. So the public health crisis provides authoritarian governments with an opportunity to implement the notorious shock doctrine. The shock doctrine was created and mentioned by Naomi Klein. They take advantage of the fact that politics are on hold and the public is stunned and protests are out of the question in order to impose measures that would be impossible in normal time. So for this decisive decade, not to be a disastrous one, people of goodwill, wherever they are, must campaign, you, me, RSF and those who fight for freedom of information, for journalists to be able to fulfill their role as society's trusted third parties, which means they must have the capacity to do so, and we have to support them. So what are our main findings in the index? As you know, Norway has been at the top of the index for the past 3 years. So it's the 4th year that Norway is at the top of the index, ranked first, while Finland was again in the runner-up. Denmark was next, and Sweden, which was down 1 rank, was 4th, and the Netherlands on the 5th rank. So both Sweden and Netherlands have fallen as a result of increases in cyber harassment that we'll mention later. The other end of the index has seen little changes. The bad countries remain the bad countries. North Korea is 180 country, has taken the last position from Turkmenistan, while Eritrea ranks 178th and continues to be the Africa worst ranked country. Malaysia and the Maldives registered the biggest rise in 2020 indexed. They really gained some ranking respectively thanks to the beneficial effects of changes of government through the polls. And the third biggest leap was by Sudan, which rose 60th place, now ranked 159th after Omar al-Bashir's removal from the country. The list of biggest declines in 2020 index is topped by Haiti, where journalists have often been targeted during violent nationwide protests for the past 2 years, and after falling 21 places, it is now ranked 83rd. The other 2 biggest falls were in Africa by Comoros, down 90 ranks in our index, now ranked 75th, and Benin, down 70 ranks, and now classified 113 in our index, both of which have seen a surge in press freedom violations. The RSF's global indicator, its measures of the level of media freedom worldwide, improved very slightly in 2020 index by 0.9%. However, it has deteriorated by 12% since the measure was created in 2013, which means the proportion of countries that have been ranked are deteriorating. The countries that are colored white on the press freedom map, the good ones, meaning that the situation for press freedom is good, is unchanged, 8%, but the percentage of countries colored in black, meaning the situation is very bad, has increased by 2 points to 13%. In the different regions, so Europe continues to be the most favorable continent for media freedom, but we'll see later that we are facing some problems in the region. It is followed by the America, North, Central, and South America, even if the regional heavyweight, the United States and Brazil, are becoming model of austerity towards the media. Despite there has been some change lately, and Africa, which is third, has also suffered major reversals, above all in the forms of prolonged arbitrary detention and online attacks. In the Asia-Pacific region that saw the greatest rise in press freedom violation, Australia, a previously good country, down 5 ranks in our index and now at 26th rank, used to be the regional model, but is now characterized by its threats to the confidentiality of sources and to investigative journalism. 2 other countries also made significant contribution to the increase in the region's press freedom violation score. Singapore, which fell 7 places, in large part thanks to its Orwellian fake news law that was voted, and joined the countries colored black on the press freedom map. The other was Hong Kong with its huge demonstration, which also fell 7 places because of this treatment of demonstration. Another worrying continent is the Eastern Europe, Central Asia region that has unsurprisingly kept its second to last place in the regional ranking, the position it has held for years, while the Middle East and North Africa continues to be the world's most dangerous region for journalists. The recent detention of Reporters Without Borders correspondent Khaled Drareni showed how the authorities in some countries have taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to settle scores with independent journalists. As we talk today, Khaled Drareni, our correspondent, a famous international journalist, has been detained for more than 7 months. He was jailed in March 29th, and since then has been condemned to 2 years in prison. And we are fighting hard to obtain his release. Regarding the crises that are threatening the journalism future, Reporters Without Borders identified 5 crises apart from the sanitary crisis. The first one is the geopolitical crisis. It's one of the most important crisis. It's caused by leaders of dictatorial, authoritarian or populist regimes making every effort to suppress information and impose their vision on a world without pluralism and independent journalism. Authoritarian regimes have kept their poor rankings. China, which is trying to establish a new world media order, maintains its system of information hyper-control, of which the negative effects for the entire world have been seen during this sanitary crisis with the COVID-19. China, Saudi Arabia, Egypt are the world's biggest jailer of journalists, and Reporters Without Borders will provide its new roundup of journalists being hostage, killed or jailed at the end of December, and these countries are not doing well at all. Russia, is meanwhile deploying increasingly sophisticated resources to control information online, while India, down 2 ranks, now at 142 ranking, has imposed the longest electronic curfew in history in Kashmir. In Egypt, there has been also often accusation of fake news that are used as grounds for blocking access to websites and web pages and for withdrawing accreditation. We've seen also a technological crisis. The absence of appropriate regulation in the area of digitalized and globalized communication has created information chaos. Propaganda, advertising, rumor, and journalism are in direct competition, and the growing confusion between commercial, political, and editorial content has destabilized democratic guarantees of freedom of opinion and expression. And this encourages the adoption of dangerous laws which, on the pretext of restricting the spread of fake news, facilitate tougher crackdowns on independent and critical journalism. There is also a democratic crisis. The 2 previous editions of our World Press Freedom Index reflected a crisis caused by growing hostility and even hatred towards journalists, and this crisis now worsened. It has resulted in more serious and frequent acts of physical violence and therefore an unprecedented level of fear in some countries. Leading politicians and those close to them continue to openly foment hatred of journalists. The democratically elected presidents of two countries, former Donald Trump in the US and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, continue to denigrate the media and encourage hatred of journalists in their respective countries. The hate cabinet surrounding the Brazilian leader orchestrate large-scale online attacks on journalists who expose government secrets, and President Bolsonaro has stepped up his attacks on the media since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, blaming them for hysteria and panic. And we've seen the situation on the ground with a very, very high level of cases and a very, very tense situation for journalists. We know there is also a crisis of trust, mistrust of media outlets suspected of broadcasting or publishing news contaminated by unreliable information continues to grow. And at this stage, we see this in a number of countries throughout the world. We'll see also an economical crisis. The digital transformation has brought the media to their knees in many countries. Falling sales, the collapse in advertising revenue, and the increase in production and distribution costs linked above all to increases in the price of raw material have forced news organizations to restructure and lay off journalists. In the US, for example, half of the media jobs have been lost over the past 10 years, and these economic problems have social consequences and an impact on the editorial freedom of media around the world. Newspapers that are in a much weaker economic situation are naturally less able to resist pressure. You probably know how the index is compiled. I would like to remind that it assesses the level of pluralism, the media independence, the environment for the media and self-censorship, the legal framework, transparency, and the quality of infrastructure that supports the production of news. That's how we work, and we have different indicators that are available on our website. Now let's have a special focus on the situation in Europe, and let's see why Europe's journalists face growing dangers. More and more of the continent's journalists are indeed suffering the consequences of a decline in the rule of law, assaults, online threats, and financial troubles. And I'm sure that at the forum, a lot of you will be able to witness this situation. Press freedom is high on the agenda of the new European Commission appointed in 2019 in accordance with recommendations published by Reporters Without Borders during the campaign for the European election. Europe was shaken up by a series of serious abuses, including murder carried out against journalists, and now is the time for it to focus on the battle for press freedom. RSF has welcomed the action plan announced by European Commission Vice President for Values and Transparency, Mrs. Vera Jourova, which provides for strengthening media freedom, making social networks more accountable and protecting the democratic process. However, it is regrettable that the EU enlargement portfolio, crucial for integrating the countries of the Western Balkans, was attributed to a commissioner from Hungary, one of the most EU's repressive government. In the new EU institution, place such important on press freedom. It is because the danger of backsliding is fully recognized. The drip towards authoritarianism has strengthened in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban has assumed full powers indefinitely, using the coronavirus, as I explained earlier, as a pretext. Anyone convicted of publishing fake news faces a prison term of 5 years. Hopefully, this provision was stopped after the virus, but still, Hungary was one of the countries with the toughest law at the time of the virus. In Poland, where the situation for female in general, female journalists, but women in general, with very strict measures on abortion and this ban on abortion, also lost 3 places this year in our index. The government's control over the judiciary has affected press freedom very largely, and some courts use an article of the Penal Code which allows sentences on journalists up to 1 year in prison on defamation charges. Up to now, judges have only imposed fines, but the damage has been done, and an underlying climate of self-censorship has now come to the surface in the country. Of course, all summer we've seen Bulgaria shaken by its demonstration and the political turmoil. Bulgaria remains the latest country among the European countries in our index, 111th. So the lowest position, and probably due to the fact that the situation has not improved. There was an attempt by the public radio management to suspend the experienced journalist Silvia Velikova, a government critic that has highlighted the lack of independence of the public radio. Of course, Montenegro and Albania are some countries we focused on. Montenegro still 105th, Albania 84th. They both fell 2 places after a year which showed journalists detained on the pretext of the fight against disinformation and instances of legal harassment exemplified by the Kafkaesque trial of investigative reporter Jovo Martinovic. So during that same period, we also saw in Serbia which fell 3 places in the 2020 index. Some very, very important and dramatic event. The house of the investigative journalist Milan Jovanovic was set to fire, and there was no solution offered in court to solve the problem. The fight against impunity for violence against journalists also has made progress in 2 EU countries. It's important to mention that in Slovakia, where Jan Kuciak, an investigative reporter, was killed in 2018, those alleged to be behind the murder of Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were brought to trial, even though the outcome was not the one a lot expected. The country moved up in the index for the first time in 3 years, and in Malta, the investigation into the murder of the journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, we mentioned at this forum the previous year, is making progress. Reporters Without Borders participated in Malta over the summer to the public inquiry, and the case is making progress, although journalists there are still coming under intense judicial pressure. We've seen verbal and physical attacks, even in France. The previous year with the Yellow Jacket movement has been also the expression of this violence by police officers as well as by demonstrators. We've seen this same situation in Spain with a breakthrough by the far-right Vox party and attacks against journalists. Spain is now ranked 29th. We've seen also the situation in Austria. And Italy, the country that interests us today, is up to 2 places, now ranked 41, while Greece is ranked 65th. And over there, reporters have been very often attacked on the ground with a very high level of hostility in a climate related to the migrants. We've seen also a case of a killing of a journalist in Northern Ireland, where journalist Lyra McKee was shot dead as she was covering rioted in a London dairy. So with Jan Kuciak, Daphne Caruana Galizia, the death of Lyra McKee was the 3rd one. But before we finish, I would like to speak about the online harassment and surveillance that is taking place in our continent, Europe. In our continent, I'm sure that you are all everywhere in the world joining this forum, but still the situation is pretty worrying. Online threats such as harassment and surveillance undermine the work of journalists throughout the continent. Even in countries where press freedom is held in high regard, online harassment is growing. In Norway, the first country, which nonetheless keeps its position, but also in Finland, ranked second, and Estonia, which has lost 3 ranks, now ranked 14th in our index. And the new threat led to Sweden's drop in the rankings, and the Netherlands, which led to the automatic promotion of Denmark. So Sweden and Netherlands have come down in our index due to this online harassment, while Denmark came up to rank 3. In Scandinavia, the most aggressive harassment of journalists comes from China and Iran, while Baltic reporters are targeted by Russian trolls. We've seen some challenges to the confidentiality of sources, which are another threat that journalists are facing in Europe, especially in Germany, where the government has proposed measures that would criminalize the handling of leaked data, as well as a draft bill allowing the intelligence services to hack into computers and smartphones and to intercept encrypted communication. We've seen also some misuse of the EU General Data Protection Regulation in Romania that has been subverted to permit the authorities and some companies to deny journalists access to information. So we've seen a very large number and a variety of attacks in Europe. I would like to make a special focus on online harassment because they do concern a lot female journalists. It's important to remind that online harassment of journalists reporting on COVID-19 has continued over the crisis. And at a time where journalist activity is crucial to provide reliable information about COVID-19, Reporters Without Borders is very concerned about this increase in cyber harassment of journalists covering the health crisis, often fueled by political leaders of movement. Journalists questioning authorities' response to the COVID-19 have found themselves targeted by online hate campaign in an attempt to silence them. The different cases documented by RSF show that this campaign, whether carried out on a massive scale by trolls armies, isolated individuals or political supporters, are often fueled by political leaders themselves, without the platform reacting adequately. In India, Vidya Krishnan, often women are very, very targeted in India, female journalist. This female journalist, Vidya Krishnan, received daily sexist insults, threats of physical violence, rape and death online since the publication of an article analyzes the insensitivity of the Indian government's response to COVID-19. A Bangladeshi blogger exiled in France, Pinaki Bhattacharya, also highlighted in a Facebook post the failure of the Bangladeshi government response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, he has been accused by several pro-government media of spreading fake news to tarnish the government's image. And at the end of March, he was twice reported as dead to Facebook and lost access to his profile for several days. We've seen some similar cases. The journalist Blaz Zaga in Slovenia was attacked online due to the attacks and threats fueled by the Slovenian Prime Minister. We've seen another female journalist facing the same kind of hate campaign in Serbia. Ana Lalic, journalist of the Serbian news website Nova.rs, was reporting on the lack of medical equipment in a local hospital which filed a criminal complaint against her, and she received daily threats and called for persecution on social network. The Prime Minister accused her of spreading fake news. So this is very alarming to see political leaders feeding the hate online against journalists just because they are not covering the COVID-19 crisis as they would like. The resulting online harassment campaigns were a serious attack on the journalist safety and the democracy itself from the beginning of the crisis in March. because harassment remains a systemic issue on online platform. This time is an unprecedented opportunity to resolve it, and beyond the COVID-19 crisis, the platforms must commit to greater transparency in their moderation operation and its action taken to combat cyber harassment of journalists. Thank you very much for having listened to this conversation and to this opening. I thank you very much, and I hope I'll meet you next year for a not virtual opening of conference. Thank you.